Hello, welcome back to the channel, and in this episode a philosopher is going to be talking about the Council of Elrond.
Hello, Miri here. So I decided we don't really need a recap of what happens during the Council of Elrond. We already know, so let's just get straight to it.
So what is the significance of a council?
Well, in the context of this film, I think it's quite complicated because a council is a coming together of equals playing a role of governance in a society, but it is the Council of Elrond. So already I think we have a little bit of a tension there, because if it's the Council of Elrond, there is a leader who's convened it. So it's both egalitarian and has a little step in it, which suggests that there is an authority in addition to the demographic circle. And they do sit in a circle. And having sat in a circle, there also seems to be a little bit of a hierarchy that pertains anyway. Not just with Elrond, but also because we have apparently elders who are gathered for the council, but we have younger people who are gathered for the council, or at least hobbits.
Yeah.
And we also have the dwarf. All of that raises the question of degrees of power, I suppose, at this council. So on the one hand, something entirely circular and equal. On the other hand, a subtle but nevertheless unmissable ranking, really, of authority in that place. And it made me think more broadly about this film, which I think is debating or portraying different modes of power or distribution of power and civic society. We've had the Shire, and in the comments, I've learned about the mayoral structure in the Shire, which seems a little more homespun, I suppose, but nevertheless has its own governance structure. We have this Council of Elrond, which has the quality of something a bit Arthurian, equal but nevertheless somewhat hierarchical, with a first among equal, a primus inter pares in Elrond, and other firsts among equals too. Then we have the realm of Sauron, and we've yet to meet Sauron, which seems to be an autocracy, even though there are what you might call lieutenants, such as Saruman, who's now apparently brought into it, who clearly has some seniority within that autocracy, but an autocracy nevertheless. And I couldn't help thinking during that of the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century, who is, because he's writing at that time during the English Civil War, preoccupied with questions of what nature of authority we need in order to hold warfare at bay. And it seems to me this whole film depends for its drama on the prospect of war.
Yeah.
And strife and struggle and conflict. And what Thomas Hobbes says is that, in fact, that is in the very nature of man. I mean, he's not talking about man in the same way that Aragorn was in the previous scene and so on, but of mankind. Thomas Hobbes says that the life of man in a state of nature is nasty, brutish and short, which is his most famous quote. And there is a constant nagging sense, I think, so far, that without some structure, without some hierarchy, at least governance, things will fall apart. The centre won't hold, and there will be this descent into a fight of all against all, which is what Thomas Hobbes says. And Thomas Hobbes says, well, therefore, we do need some governance structure. Hobbes' answer is very different from the one in the film. He says we need a sort of elected autocrat, which is a contradiction in terms. He calls it the Leviathan, the whale. But I think there is that interesting political question here about what's the minimum amount of governance required in order to maintain harmony, but to stiffen the resolve of the society against attack from without. So all of that, I think, is going on in the very notion of the Council of Elrond.
We see Gimli try to destroy the ring with his axe, and the axe just falls to pieces. I guess that's the first time we've seen it be so indestructible.
Well, there's a question there as well, isn't there, about whether it's indestructible or not. It's indestructible to all intents and purposes all of the time, except in one specific case, which Elrond reminds us of, namely being returned to its origin and dispatched back into the fire of origin from which it was forged. So indestructible, yes, except in under those conditions. And that's interesting for me because it's as if time itself almost needs to be put into reverse to go back to the origin, to go back to the alpha, not to take it to a kind of omega. There's no end state for the ring. It's almost taking it back to its state before it was created in order to destroy it. So there's a profound theological question there about the presence of nothing before something. Because if the ring was forged, it didn't have to be forged, it was created. But before it was created, it wasn't created. There was a nothing before there was something. And the way to destroy it is to take it back to the nothing before the something, the moment of pre-creation. So it's not destruction, actually, that we're talking about. We're talking about destroying the ring, not through destruction, but through pre-creation. So that's quite an interesting, actually a theological notion there. It's not actually destruction, it's pre-creation, so that we're going back in time, effectively, in order to abolish or annul its power of having been created in the first place. And, in the last episode, we were talking about these temporal structures in The Lord of the Rings, there and back again, prequels and sequels and so on. And I think what's going on here, again, is a bit of a time warp in relation to the ring.
Yeah, because to destroy it, you have to put it back into the fires that it was made. So
exactly.
It's not,
so it's not actually
it's not
destruction.
being destroyed. Yeah, it's just being put
exactly.
back.
And because the attempt to smash it there by the elf fails, we can see immediately how crude that effort is. Let's destroy it. Well, there is no destroying it because it's indestructible, and because its nature is almost metaphysical. The only way to destroy it is to take it back to a time before destruction, before the possibility of destruction, before the conditions of possibility of destruction have been set through an act of creation. Because there's no destruction that can eventuate unless creation has taken place. You can't destroy what hasn't been created, however. So take it back to a place before it's created, which is the matrix or crucible of its creation. So I find that very interesting because it has that theological, temporal, metaphysical time warp element in it.
Is there a link to Prometheus and the fire?
Yes, there are links to the myth of Prometheus. I don't think in the myth of Prometheus we have quite the same mind-bending temporality in it. But there is, I think, an allusion to Prometheus as the god of fire and creativity. And I think also, if you remember Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, and the epigraph, or rather the subtitle to...
Oh, yeah, modern day Prometheus.
Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. Yeah. I think that's important because, particularly in terms of the manufacture of the sub-orcs or super-orcs, we've had a moment of Frankensteinian interest, I suppose, and perhaps reference. So there is a Promethean, Frankensteinian strain, I think, which is evoked there in the kind of smelting or forging of the ring and the kind of the mastery of fire as the kind of way in which humans hubristically become a bit like gods. And there's a theme of hubris, I think, throughout this, where human beings take on so much power out of a kind of vanity that it will destroy them. But nevertheless, I think that's a slightly different case, that Promethean aspect, from this more what I would describe as metaphysical instance, where you can't destroy the ring because it's been created, and once created can't be destroyed. The only way to destroy it is to take it back to a place before creation, because that which isn't created isn't therefore susceptible to producing all the effects of chaos that it then produces.
We see Boromir really try and convince the council to give the ring to Gondor, where he's from, and use it against Sauron. And he talks about having to defend the rest of Middle-earth from Sauron because his city's the nearest to Mordor. Do you have any observations on his motives?
Well, he, like the others at the Council of Elrond, have been assembled for what's effectively a war cabinet. And they've each got different ideas about it. So we've had the dwarf trying to smash it. Let's just get it very crudely. Obviously, that's not going to work. And now we have Boromir saying, no, let's mobilise its energy and power. And therefore, ironically, is putting himself in the lineage of Isildur, who was apparently, from what we've seen in the previous flashback, in the previous clip, wanted to do the same. As if to say, well, I'm bigger than the ring. I can somehow master it. Whatever it is, I am capable of turning its unpredictable power towards my own ends. I can bend its will according to my own. So it's a manifestation of vanity, really, on his part, as it was for Isildur in the previous
and
scene.
It's kind of playing into Elrond's view of what men are like.
It's playing onto that, into the notion of men as a little bit vain, a little bit corruptible, a little bit hubristic again. Feeling they are a bit more godlike than they actually are.
Yeah.
And of course, so far, we have other versions of quasi-divinity in the notion of magic and wizardry, particularly through Gandalf, but also through Saruman. So there are these questions about the limits of human power. There does seem to be an absolute limit there, which we run up against in the Ring and Sauron. And Sauron's power, as far as we know so far, appears to be unassailable. But yeah, we've had a adumbration, I suppose, of the idea that men can go beyond ordinary human power through wizardry. But it's not clear at all that Boromir even has wizardry at his disposal. It feels like, I don't know yet, but it feels like he is, as it were, just another man at this point, and therefore just as susceptible as Isildur was to the corrupting effects of power. Power corrupts.
And then there's a lot of tension in the scene. We've got the tension between him and Aragorn, and the tension between Legolas the elf and Gimli the dwarf.
Yeah, we do. And I think that, again, speaks to this idea of the fragility of the council. It's come together under duress because of a common enemy, but at the same time, tribal cracks also appear, and there is an attempt to paper over those cracks a bit, which the notion of the fellowship is really designed to do, because the fellowship is that which harmonizes and bonds. Actually is a little bit of a isotope, perhaps, of the shape of the ring. The ring itself is circular. The council as a political structure is full of tension, as you've just described. And so we move from ring to council to fellowship. The ring is too hot to handle, almost literally. The council has an expedient value in producing, or at least gathering and trying to produce political consensus. But actually, it's only the concept of the fellowship which resolves out into something which can be workable and gives the movie the forward movement into action. So, but there is tension, yes, and we have this reveal about Strider actually being Aragorn, which creates a moment of, what you described as, but maybe grudging respect from Boromir when he sees that. Because I think up till that point there'd been this rather macho standoff between the two of them, and this question, are we friends, are we foes, are we going to work together or apart? Who's the more significant? It's a bit alpha male, I suppose, that playoff. But it feels like that is a decisive reveal when Boromir learns who Strider actually is. And it does seem to slightly put him in his place.
Yeah, do you think so?
Well, I'd be interested in your view of that.
Yeah, I guess I never thought about it. I guess because I know that his dad is the steward of Gondor, I saw it as him kind of, I don't know, like a bit of Yeah, I guess, yeah, you're right, being put in his place, because he's worried about his father's position if there's this heir. But also, I feel like maybe Boromir was aware there's a difference between them, like they're very different characters.
They're very different characters, and I think one of the main differences is that Aragorn manifests this capacity for emotional self-regulation. He's very measured, I suppose, in a way that Boromir isn't, and that suggests something a little less mature on the part of Boromir, and perhaps a little bit shaming in the context of the council. For him to be ever so slightly, I wouldn't want to stress this, exposed, I think, in that council as not being as crude as the dwarf in trying to smash the ring, but certainly not being as judicious as Aragorn is in his attitude towards it all.
Yeah, he comes across as uncultured,
A little bit hot-headed.
Yeah.
He's a bit of a Tybalt in that scene, the character from Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, so there is that, and I think effectively Aragorn wins that faith off without actually having to fight.
Yeah.
He gets the popular vote.
Yeah.
And it is a space of voting implicitly, but he also gets, I think, the viewer vote out of that scene.
Yeah. And then we see the tension between the dwarf and the elves.
Yes, we see that too. So that's, again, we have these things matched at different levels, don't we? So we have the Aragorn-Boromir tension, and then at a, as it were, apparently at least a lower social level or power level, elves and dwarves. So there are these kind of, just as we've had Gandalf and Saruman, we have these pairs of interesting friends but enemies, or frenemies almost, kind of throughout, don't we? Because Gandalf and Saruman had been in that space, from friends to enemies, and now sort of in between. And similarly, so it's quite interesting how that friend or foe tension runs through at those different pairing levels down the kind of spine of the hierarchy, as it were.
Oh, I mean, I was just going to add that we saw in the previous clip Elrond talk about dwarfs being selfish and just caring about mining. That's all they care about. As in, like, you can't trust the dwarfs to destroy the ring because of...
No, that's right. And yet they make for a expedient set of colleagues, and certainly in the face of Sauron, this coalition of the willing has to work in some ways, even if there is judgment and snobbery and tension and rivalry between them, and that would probably come out if there weren't this existential threat in Middle Earth that's arising. But you do see that, what Freud calls the narcissism of minor differences between these characters. That's what's, I think, interesting in those pairings, that Gandalf and Saruman, firstly, Boromir and Aragorn, secondly, the elf and the dwarf, they are pairings of semi-likes, semi-similar individuals, and they're more similar than different, but the differences are the things that they slightly jealously guard in relation to one another. And again, that's exactly what Freud would describe as the narcissism of minor differences.
We see Frodo being really affected by the ring. When the ring starts to talk, or when people are arguing around the ring, he's visibly he looks like he's in pain.
Yeah, I mean, so the ring speaks in the sense that there are these guttural vocalizations, the black speech is emitted during that. So everybody is affected. There's this rumbling noise, and we're in the world of some awful, reverberating, doom-laden set of whatever they are, edicts, maybe just apocryphal statements, we don't know, nostrums of some kind. Frodo seems extra affected. So not only is he caught up in that cavernous reverberation of sounds, he's also seemingly taken back to that moment in the Prancing Pony when the image, the almost mandala-like almond-shaped image of the ring, or the energy of the ring appears to him. We seem to be taken into his psyche, I think, at that moment, and the origin of the ring as that mandala almond shape, fiery energy is activated in him. And it's activated in him because I think for a few reasons. One, he's already shown himself to be a particularly resonant individual, and perhaps that's why he is chosen for this task. He seems to be attuned to the darker, more invisible forces in Middle-earth than perhaps most people are. He's a bit like an empath in some ways, but an empath of the ring. So there's that. We've also had him actually be given the ring originally by Bilbo, so he is in contact with it in some senses already. He's been touched by it and maybe contaminated by it. We have had him in the Prancing Pony, as I say, have this experience of kind of disappearing and being swooning and being almost sort of wiped out by it. And then that leads also to the wound that he gets.
Yeah, he's been stabbed by the Nazgul.
Right, which seems to carry, the poison or whatever it is that carries seems somehow to be associated with the power of the ring. So all of those things are going on. But I think what's particularly interesting for me in that scene when the ring is damaged and the effect it has on Frodo is that we have, in a way, the classic effect of magic or voodoo, which is this Latin phrase is often used for it, actio in distans, action at a distance. What makes magic magic is that there can be a relation through the airwaves, through the ether, through the vibrations of sound or air between two things, an object and a person. So voodoo dolls would be the kind of most vivid sort of tabloid example, I suppose, of that. But we see it quite vividly here that although the ring seems to be an object, it's not an object in the sense it's not objective and detached. It is somehow part of the same psychic sphere that he's in, or at least vibrates on the same frequency as him. And so he has become, as it were, a agent or creature of magic inadvertently. And the inadvertently, I think, is important because, again, throughout, or at least thus far, Frodo's innocence seems to be one of his prime and most appealing attributes, and yet he's not innocent of the relationship to the ring. Or you could argue it kind of inversely, because of his innocence, because he's not corruptible in the same way that men are, because he's not power hungry, because he seems relatively egoless compared to some of the others, and maybe partly because of his age, he is all the more capable of vibrating with these frequencies. And of course then we get on to this, what I find rather extraordinary phase, where he is again allowed to recruit himself into this task of heading into Mordor, which sounds like a suicide mission effectively. And rather than the elders saying, oh no, you're far too young, don't do that, you've done your task, dear boy, you really can't, they sit back and let him. And I couldn't help chuckling at that, thinking all these brave men are being rather cowardly, allowing this, well, I know that ages are all rather overdetermined in Lord of the Rings, but he looks like still an adolescent being sent into battle like a private in the army, while the generals and strategists sit back and say, jolly good show, we'll think of you, And even Gandalf has this look of pride and being touched or whatever as Frodo takes on this task or nominates himself for this task. But at the same time, I couldn't help feeling, well, you're rather letting the suicide, bomber go in while you sit back and manage your council.
He does look regretful at first. He kind of closes his eyes in a way that he's not surprised. He didn't want it to get to that. He was hoping someone else would be able to do it. But why do you think Frodo volunteers?
Well, I think Frodo volunteers because of its systemic loyalty. I'm very interested in this notion of systemic constellations and the work of Bert Hellinger, and I'm a practitioner also of systemic constellations. And what systemic work says is that the pull of the system is often greater than the will of the individual. And the system for Frodo is still really the Shire and the sense of loyalty he feels to the hobbits and to people, in fact, beyond the hobbit world as well, because their goodness, their generosity of spirit extends beyond themselves. They have a kind of, I slightly hesitate to use this word, to be honest, but it's almost Christian ability to look out for the good of the neighbour, for the other, the Samaritan sort of quality to them. And because of his adherence to loyalty to that system and the ethic of that system, he volunteers. And his innocence is really what allows him to be recruited systemically there. It's not a feat of bravery in its intention. He's not trying to say, look, I'm the brave one here, look at me. I'm so tough and macho and bold. He's more saying, I will give myself to this task because it's the right thing to do. And it has a sense of sacrifice to it. We talked a little bit about sort of Christian elements so far. And it's as if he's saying, I will sacrifice myself here. And going back to that sequence we have of the facial expressions on Gandalf's face, I wonder how many takes they did of that, because there are so many things that have to be included in that set of emotions. Because I would imagine if I was in Gandalf's shoes, I'd also feel a pang of guilt about allowing...
He does look guilty.
Do you think so?
Yeah.
Yeah, and he doesn't resist it. None of them say, oh, no, you can't do that. You're far too young. You're just a hobbit or whatever. But then there is this instinct or a kind of collective intelligence of the group, which is how the fellowship forms, as if to say, no, actually, the sacrifice of the individual hobbit, that systemic loyalty is too much here. It has to be shared and possibly even diluted among the fellowship. So the fellowship is quite an interesting notion systemically, because it's saying the sacrifice of one is too much. That sacrifice has to be shared. And fellowship is really, as far as it seems to be in this scene, the concept of shared sacrifice, or the potential for sacrifice to be shared rather than sit on the shoulders of one individual, which I think would be unbearable for everybody. So there's also self-saving that's going on in that, because if you imagine the scenario in which Frodo alone is sent off to Mordor and doesn't return, or returns even more traumatized, then you can imagine the extra guilt everybody would feel. So although it's a beautiful moment and there's a sense almost a premature reconciliation there,
they're shamed into it.
It's not made explicit, but I think in terms of the ethics involved there will have been a moment of potential ethical inner shaming that says, well, in order to prevent future shame, we will now share the responsibility of sacrifice among this fellowship. And if it's shared, maybe we'll all be okay. And it seems that's what fellowship in this scene means. We talked about fellowship earlier in relation to Tolkien's own biography in Oxford colleges and so on. But in this particular case, fellowship is more like the fellowship of disciples around Christ or something like that.
And it's interesting the order that they all volunteer. So we've got Gandalf first, then Aragorn, then Legolas, then Gimli, and then it's Boromir.
Yes, and again, that's almost following the order of shame, to use your point. It would have been the most shameful thing if Gandalf had come last. So I think there is a systemic ordering there of the shame quotient. I wanted just quickly to add that we do have this word doom, and it's not for the first time. In the previous episode, we were talking about the difference between fate and destiny. Fate is what you inherit. Destiny is the way in which you steer your life going forward within some of the constraints of fate. But here we have the word doom. Now, fate is a Latin word, most famously written about in philosophy, perhaps by Friedrich Nietzsche, who talked about amor fati, the love of fate, the fact we have to embrace our fate. But here we have doom, which is comes from a different root altogether, Anglo-Saxon, ultimately Proto-Indo-European. And doom really connotes law or necessity. So in Greek, it would be things like ananke, possibly nomos, but a higher order law that must be obeyed. And that seems to be even above the notion of fate. And one wonders the degree to which the fellowship here is actually powerless in regards to what will happen, even if it does use its best efforts to return the ring to its origins, that actually there may be this thing called doom, which determines things over and above their own abilities. So I just wanted to put that in, that there may be, an even greater force in the world than fate. And doom, by the way, isn't always bad, although we think of, like Shakespeare's phrase, the crack of doom, or doomsday, meeting your doom. I mean, it does have negative connotations, but it can also refer just simply to the highest ineluctable law of the order of things.
We see, like right at the end, we see Sam, Merry and Pippin, the other hobbits, run in, and Elrond says, you weren't invited to this secret council. It's interesting that they've been excluded from this, and Frodo being the only hobbit to represent the hobbits. They're instantly accepted as part of the fellowship, but they don't really have anything like a sword or a bow, so it's not as obvious to what they can give to the fellowship apart from just...
Yeah, and I think at that point, Frodo is in such credit that he could have the whole of the Shire with him and nobody would say anything, because they are implicitly now part of this quest of fellowship, I think. I mean, I think in terms of the viewer, they are there to add humour to the story. The films are PG, so they're there to add a sense of relatability, I think, for younger viewers. And I think those things are important just to be aware of in that. But of course, I mean, they go in even more like corporals or privates into the army because they're completely undefended. They don't even seem to have these gifts that Frodo has for magic or resonance or so on.
Yeah, it's almost like a representation of war fodder.
They do seem a bit like war fodder. I mean, I think one must always be a little bit wary of the psychobiography around this and reading Tolkien's own experience into it. But it does feel like a cabinet of war meeting and then sending in infantry who are recruited from the youngest and most naive and who will become cannon fodder.
Yeah, and ignorant of what they're going to. They have no idea.
No, ignorant of what they're going to, Mordor, and yet with a slightly patriotic sense, really, of dulce et decorum est. It's sweet and proper to give yourself in sacrifice, again, to use that word, in warfare to the cause. The cause isn't quite a national cause here, but it's the cause of the Shire and this band of broadly goodies, I suppose.
I think from the motive of the viewer, it's seen as just a friendship. My friend's going, I want to go too, and I want to support. Yeah,
I mean, it's friendship and it's hobbitship, isn't it? Yeah. They are comrades as a race, if that's the right word for hobbits. Yeah, there's something naive, but also a little bit more heavy, I suppose, about that. They go in kind of unguarded. They're about to go over the top from the trenches, aren't they? To this place, Mordor, which of course strikes fear into the heart of men. One does not simply walk into Mordor. Of course, the word Mordor is wonderfully, I don't know, Hibernian sounding to me. Scottish sense of Mordor, death and destruction, and obviously associates with the word murder too.
Had you seen that meme before?
I hadn't seen that meme before, no.
Have you not? Yeah, but have you not seen like the memes change?
There's something vaguely at the back of my mind. So when I heard that phrase, I thought, have I heard that before? One does not simply walk into Mordor, but yeah.
Thank you for watching. Please remember to like, subscribe, and please become a member if you would like to see the videos 24 hours earlier than anyone else. and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you.